ترجمه به زبان فارسی برای دوستان فارسی زبان در انتهای این اتاق هست. دوستانی که تازه تشریف آوردن و میخوان از ترجمه فارسی استفاده کنن لطفاً به عقب اتاق تشریف ببرن.
I was just going to say that, but she does it much more eloquently. Dear friends, it's been such an exciting conference. Is this? Okay. And I'm so excited. This is one of these things where year after year, I haven't been a Baha'i very long, but year after year, it seems like this is sort of a milestone or a measurement during the year that we say, oh, it's Green Lake time again. And when you're getting in that car on Friday and starting to drive here to Green Lake, it's just like a magic because you know you're going to see all these friends and all the new faces and so on every year, thousands of Baha'is. I was moved on my way up here to read a prayer on my way up from the stage, not from Minnesota. And I wanted to read this prayer. It's part of a prayer from Baha'u'llah. And I thought about it because I was asking for help from Baha'u'llah to be an instrument to give something for the believers here today. And I started thinking about how precious each one of the believers are, and I remembered this prayer that I read from Baha'u'llah. It's a very long prayer, but I want to read just one paragraph from it that describes a little bit about the station of the believers. Baha'u'llah writes, "Thy might beareth me witness. I am well aware that were I to bow myself before a handful of dust from now until the end that hath no end, in acknowledgement of its relationship to thy name, the Fashioner, I would still find myself far removed from that dust and incapable of approaching it, and would discover that such an adoration can in no wise befit it, nor transcend the limitations to which I myself have been subjected. And were I to arise to serve one of thy servants, and to wait at his door so long as thine own kingdom endureth and thine omnipotence will last, as a sign of my acknowledgement of the tie that bindeth him to thy name, the Creator, I would likewise, and to this thy glory beareth me witness, have to confess my complete failure to do him adequate service, and my deprivation of what can truly befit his station." Baha'u'llah is quoted in the Advent of Divine Justice as writing that the station of the believers are so great that that God has decided to conceal them, to conceal our station from ourselves. He said, because otherwise it would be chaos. That's my words, not his. In fact, to paraphrase Baha'u'llah, he said that if to an extent smaller than the eye of a needle, the station of such a believer were to be disclosed, that all of mankind would be dumbfounded. And for that reason, the station of the believers has been concealed. So we really don't know how precious we are. And it's the wisdom of God that we don't. Recently, I was having a discussion about Baha'i personality, or personality in general, because I was thinking, isn't it interesting, in the future, I was thinking, we won't know each other by the kind of the ways that we know each other now. You know, we think of so-and-so as being this and that and so on, and we describe their personality now, because I was thinking, in the future, we're going to probably be known much more by our spiritual attributes. The Persians have a beautiful way of putting it. In fact, it seems that in the East, they even name their children and take on names. And among the native people, too, this is true in America. They take on the spiritual attributes from the fashioner, God. And it's interesting, we were discussing this, and we were discussing about some of the early believers, because many times, in fact, this is true even with one of the relatives of my wife. Her grandfather had written to Abdu'l-Baha, and when he received the tablet back from Abdu'l-Baha, he was addressed by another name. Abdu'l-Baha changed his name. And it seems that this happened with Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha many times. They changed their name. They gave them a different name, some spiritual attribute. And we were talking, and this is totally just Baha'i chat, you know. Nothing from the writings, believe me. Just Baha'i chat and speculation. We were thinking that all of us human beings, we have all of the attributes of God. All of the human beings do. But certain attributes shine brighter than others in all of us. In fact, we have this constellation, like the heavens, like the firmament, all the stars. Each one of us are like the firmament. We have this constellation, and each star representing an attribute, a spiritual attribute of God. And we all have them all. But like in the heavens, some stars are brighter than others. And it seems to me that either because of the wisdom of our Creator, or through our own development, our own spiritual development, we learn somehow to polish certain stars. And they shine brighter. And so some of us, we know each other by the different constellations. We look at one of our fellow believers or another human being, believer or not, in the Baha'i faith, and we say, that person has such a beautiful character. That person has such a great sense of humor. That person is so truthful and trustworthy. And it seems like we become known by we all have this certain constellation. But through the wisdom of God, it seems, according to Baha'u'llah, our true constellation, our true characters remain concealed from us. Because if we knew about it, chaotic things might happen. In fact, in the history of our faith, it seems that many times when the believers were given a name by Baha'u'llah, a spiritual name, that sometimes it was almost too much for them. And they became proud and actually fell away from the faith. They became so proud of their perceived station or their new name from Baha'u'llah. And actually it was too much. Not all of them, of course, but some of them did. And I was thinking, what a great test it would be to really know your station. And so for that reason, not even to an extent smaller than the eye of a needle do we know it. But we know enough. We know enough about ourselves. We know for a fact that we are created noble. And that anything that's evil or disgusting about our character that's ungodlike is acquired. It's something we acquired. Well, now, I had no intention of talking about this at all, and I don't know why I am. In fact, when I came up, I thought about something entirely different. Excuse me, with your permission, I'm going to as I was coming up, I was looking at these beautiful pictures over here of Mount Carmel, and I was thinking about one early believer that I had a small identity with, and I'll explain that. His name was Badi. Many of you know him. He was a young man who was sent by Baha'u'llah to deliver the message from Baha'u'llah to the Shah of Iran and was subsequently tortured and martyred. Well, don't think that I have an identity with him because he was so great and such a great martyr and servant of Baha'u'llah. But I have a little bit of identity with Badi because he had such a... his character was transformed by Baha'u'llah. And I identify with Badi a little bit because he was kind of a stinker before he became Baha'i. In fact, his father, who was a great believer and a survivor of Sheikh Tabarsi, you know, the battle at Sheikh Tabarsi, a servant of the Bab who served under the command of Mullah Hussein and Quddus and so on, survived that battle where 12,000 troops of the Shah were pitted against 313 Babis. And he survived that. And he just threw up his arms. He didn't know what to do about this young boy. In fact, in the Persian language, I think they called him sort of Shaitun, you know, Kheli Shaitun. He was really kind of almost a troublemaker, you know. And his father didn't know what to do with him. But during a visit of one of the travel teachers, one of the early believers who was a companion of Baha'u'llah and a great servant of Baha'u'llah, Nabil. Some of you know that name, Nabil Yazam, who was the, you know, historian and poet and the author of the Dawnbreakers. He was visiting in Khorasan. I think Khorasan was where he was living. And his father, he noticed that Badi's father was serving the guests himself. And somebody made a comment, "Don't you have a son?" You know, kind of like, "What's the deal? What's wrong with your son? Has he got a broken arm or something? He can't help out here?" And he was a little bit, I think he must have been a little bit embarrassed, and he says, "You know, I really don't know what to do with this kid." You know, those are my words, not his, of course. He says, "I don't know what to do." And Nabil says, give a few days with me. Give him some time with me. And they sat down and they started reading the holy writings together, the creative word of Baha'u'llah. And Nabil started telling some of the stories from the early history of the faith. Of course, that was early history too, but this was earlier history. Some of the heroism and so on of some of the Babis, and it touched his heart. It touched his heart and he started to change. And then Nabil said that he was going to visit Baha'u'llah. And Badi asked his father if he could go along. And eventually was able to get on foot all the way, thousands of miles. He walked and arrived in the prison city in Akka. Now, he had been serving the believers. He'd become very much in love with the faith of Baha'u'llah and wanting to serve the friends. And so, what he did was, the way he served the believers is that there were some believers that were with Baha'u'llah in Baghdad, and they were left when Baha'u'llah was exiled to Constantinople, and they were really at the mercy of the people around that area and heavily persecuted there. And so one of the believers that was helping the Baha'is in that area, helping them by carrying the water, going to the spring and the well and carrying the water to these Baha'i families, was martyred, was killed by some of these Muslims in this area. And so Badi, when he heard about that, said he volunteered to carry the water. And he dressed in just a simple dress of a water carrier and carried every day bags of water back and forth from the well to these people. And when he finally decided, his heart moved him to go to Akka, to the prison city, to visit the Blessed Beauty there, he was dressed like that. And he had no trouble getting into the prison because nobody noticed him. Nobody thought that this was a Baha'i or something because he was dressed so poorly. I thought some fella, and he went right in, but he didn't know what to do. He said, now what do I do? He was in the prison city, and he said, how am I going to contact Baha'u'llah? And so he said, well, I'll pray about it. And he went to the mosque, and he was praying, and all of a sudden he heard some people come into the mosque that were speaking Persian. And he looked, and among them was Abdul-Baha. And he wrote down on a piece of paper that he was here and who he was and so on, and gave it eventually to Abdul-Baha. And Abdul-Baha arranged for him that night to go into the prison. And during that stay, he had 2 times that we know about that he met face to face with Baha'u'llah, the Blessed Beauty. And Baha'u'llah writes later in a tablet that he took Badi and he changed him. Now, for a long time, Baha'u'llah, ever since Adrianople, where the son of Baha'u'llah, the sun, S-U-N, the son of Baha'u'llah's revelation had reached its zenith in Adrianople. In that remote prison, Baha'u'llah had written to all the kings and powerful people on the earth. He'd written this very powerful tablet to the Shah of Iran. But he hadn't found anyone among his servants that he considered worthy to deliver it. Even though there were many of the veteran believers serving Baha'u'llah and so on, he chose Badi, this young boy. Only 18 or 19, I think, at the time. He chose Badi. And Badi left the prison because it was too dangerous to give him that tablet in the prison. Badi left the prison and he went to Mount Carmel. That's what made me think about this on the way up to the stage. He went to Mount Carmel and he waited there according to Baha'u'llah's instructions. And one of the believers took a small box, just a small box, and the believer didn't know what was in this box, and brought it to Badi with a small envelope. Badi opened the envelope and saw that it was a tablet from Baha'u'llah addressed to him, Badi. And he walked a little ways away from this other fellow, and he faced towards Akka, across the bay, towards where Baha'u'llah was imprisoned. And he sat down and read it. And it told him in this tablet that he'd been chosen among all the believers to deliver this tablet to the Shah of Iran. And that the tablet was in this box. And Baha'u'llah told him not to have contact, to walk on foot back to Iran, and exactly what to do and how to go about this, not to have contact with the Baha'is and so on. And the other Baha'i said, could I have a look at the tablet, And Badi said, no, there's no time. And he knew right away that meant, no, he couldn't. And so he took that box that contained the tablet to the Shah. And the man said, now I have to give you some money for the journey from Baha'u'llah. And Badi said, all right, I'll wait here. You go get the money. And when the man came back, Badi was gone. So quickly the man wired, sent the messenger to Beirut, said, if you see Badi, make sure you give him the money for the journey. They wired back, they said nobody'd seen him. He set out immediately, had this mission. In fact, one of the people later on that had been traveling with Badi, one of these people said that Badi was very happy all the way back to Iran. He traveled a little way with Badi, and he said, but there was something unusual about Badi, that about every 100 steps, Badi would walk off to the side of the road, he would turn back towards Akka, and he would bow down on the ground and say a prayer. And then he would get up and walk 100 more steps and do this. And he did this all the way back to Iran. It took him 4 months to walk back to Iran. And he did exactly, his father didn't even know he was in town, in Tehran. He did exactly what Baha'u'llah said. He was so obedient. He went to a hill outside of Tehran where he knew the Shah would be coming by. And he waited there all day. This day. He prayed and fasted for about 4 days when he got to Tehran, and he found out where the Shah was, and he went to this hilltop. And he sat there and he waited until the Shah came by. And he stood up and he got the attention of some of the people around the Shah. And he shouted out in a very respectful way to the king of Iran. He said, "O Shah, I've come from Sheba with a weighty message." And the Shah noticed how bold he was and knew right away, according to the people around the Shah knew right away that this was a message from Baha'u'llah. They arrested Badi and they took the message from him, and the Shah said, "Give it to the mullahs in Tehran and have them reply." It was such a powerful message, the mullahs sent the message back to the Shah that was just nothing, don't bother with it, and so on. But they took Badi and they wanted to find out if he had any conspirators, any people that were plotting to hurt the Shah or anything, and they tortured him for days. Some Baha'i historians have described this torture. And they said that the executioner and the torturer said that they never saw anything like it, this young man. And finally he was killed. He knew that he was going to be killed because in that tablet, which still exists, by the way, that tablet that Baha'u'llah wrote to Badi with the instructions, said that not only had he been chosen to deliver this tablet, but that it was very likely that he would be killed as well, and that he should be happy. So he came from this background of being what his father thought was incorrigible, and arrived at this station through the grace and power of Baha'u'llah, that Baha'u'llah grieved and wrote about Badi for months and months after his martyrdom. Friends, as we go through the transition from this old world order to the new world order, it seems like we're purging from ourselves all of those limitations and restrictions that prevent us from contributing our full potential to this unfolding new world order. And it seems that there are certain things that are required in order to purge that. In other words, there's a whole approach to development in the Baha'i faith. There's an approach to an understanding, a concept of development in the Baha'i faith. One idea about this is that it's evolutionary. That growth and development in the Baha'i faith is evolutionary. Now think of the implications of that. We shouldn't ever look back at ourselves and lament, right? Because it's evolutionary. Even the whole idea of progressive revelation implies evolution. So that means that we never look at any of the early believers, we never look at any of our fellow believers, and we never look at ourselves in terms of our past behavior that we're not happy about or that's disappointing. Really, when you think about that approach to development, it makes it so much easier to love the friends. Abdul Baha said in one of his tablets, he said that if we look at the things that are, he said, one must see in every human being only that which is worthy of praise. When this is done, one can be a friend to the whole human race. If, however, we look at people from the standpoint of their faults, then being a friend to them is a formidable task. We don't want to make this any harder on ourselves than it already is. And he gives us a little bit of an ingredient here. In fact, one of the things I think about is that so many times in the Baha'i writings there's reference in metaphors, beautiful descriptions, imagery of a flower growing and a flower garden. And I think about us as being like a flower bud that hasn't opened yet. Each one of us is like this. There's a hint in one of the tablets that Baha'u'llah wrote to the husband and wives, to the partners, to marriage partners. He said that they may ever improve the spiritual life of each other. It seems that one of the tasks we have as Baha'is, not just as marriage partners and so on, but as friends and Baha'is, is to help improve the spiritual life of each other. Now, if each of us is like this flower bud, we know that when it develops its full potential, it will blossom and shed this beautiful fragrance and beauty on the world. Now, as a friend or a marriage partner, what I want to do is I want that to open up. I want to contribute in some way to that opening up, right? What's the best method to do that, do you think? One is I could take it and say, come on, grow. Let's, come apart. Let's blossom. Hurry, I could point out all of the negative things that I perceive as weaknesses. But that won't work. In fact, that makes us close up even more when someone does that to me. That's the way I feel. So I'm thinking, now how can I, if all of my fellow believers, all of the people on earth, frankly, including my marriage partner, is like this flower bud, how can I contribute most to this blossoming? Because as Baha'is, if the sooner we do this with everybody on earth, we'll have this beautiful flower garden. How can we do it? Well, it seems that if we're wise gardeners, we'll want to contribute in some way to creating the most nurturing environment for this blossom to open. And that requires something else that I noticed in this tablet from Abdu'l-Baha to marriage partners. He said, each, however, must exercise the utmost care to become thoroughly acquainted with the character of the other. So, a gardener, first of all, you can't, some flowers will require lots of water and some just a little. Some plants need lots of sunshine and others need just a little bit. Some need this temperature, some need this temperature. We have to become, as gardeners, as wise gardeners anyway, of the flower garden of humanity, we need to become thoroughly, as Abdu'l-Baha says, thoroughly acquainted with the characteristics of these flowers. So then when we're acquainted, we can create the greatest environment, the most nurturing environment for it to blossom. We can give it just the right amount of water, just the right amount of sunshine, just the right nutrients, everything for it to blossom. And it seems that nothing else will work except a nurturing environment. It does nothing can speed it up. We can't pull the petals apart. We can't pull it up like that. Nothing will work. In fact, when we try anything else, it usually ends in failure. The only thing that works is the nurturing environment. So when we're frustrated about a fellow believer and we're wondering, why doesn't that flippin' thing blossom? What's our first reaction? We want to let the assembly know about their weaknesses and the fact that they're not blossoming? Heavens no. We want to let them know? Heavens no. We want to let the other believers know? Heavens no. We want to provide the most nurturing environment. And if it isn't blossoming, if it's stubborn, we need even more sunshine and more water and more nutrients. We need to work even harder to provide that nurturing environment. It seemed like everybody that came in contact with Abdu'l-Baha or Baha'u'llah, just about everyone, was transformed because there was that instant acquaintance that Baha'u'llah and particularly I'm thinking of Abdu'l-Baha because I know so many stories of Abdu'l-Baha and how people came in contact with him. They felt totally loved, this unconditional love. The Universal House of Justice just wrote to the believers in the United States a wonderful letter. And one of the examples they use in this letter over and over is the qualities of speech. In fact, they encourage us, this is very interesting to me, they encourage us to develop a new etiquette of expression. Now, after I read that letter, I started looking through the Baha'i writings at all the because I wanted to become more literate, Baha'i-wise. I started trying to figure out more about words, speech, tongue. I started looking up these words in the Baha'i writings and the different contexts, the different tablets that Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha use these words. Tongue. From the scabbard of utterance, and conquer the hearts of men, and sheath your tongue. And in another tablet he said that this tongue is very powerful. All throughout the writings he says that really this tongue can be used for good or bad. And of course we only have a short time on this planet, and we want everything that this tongue creates to contribute in some way. To contribute in some way to the building up of the New World Order. Now that can mean many things. First of all, when we become thoroughly acquainted with each other's character, then we know, of course, what we can say and can't say. In fact, that can't say is even more important sometimes than can say. I remember one time one of the early believers in the West was so happy because he had arranged an audience. Can you imagine this? Arranged an audience with Abdu'l-Baha for his father, who wasn't a Baha'i. Can you imagine? Those of you who have non-Baha'i relatives like myself say, well, I'd like you to meet the master. He had arranged for his father to meet the master. And his father came in to see the master and sat down and started talking and talking and talking. And for 30 minutes, as he tells it, he said, I was shrinking up like a, wet washcloth in the corner. He said, my father talked and talked and talked and talked. And Abdu'l-Baha listened and listened and listened. For 30 minutes, his father talked. He says, my God. And he walked away just feeling awful. And as he tells it, his father turned to him and said, what a wonderful man. He was so impressed with Abdu'l-Baha. He didn't say anything. So sometimes what you shouldn't say is more important than what you should say. And knowing that, it's very important, I think, for us to understand that the Universal House of Justice knows that about us in this American Baha'i community and has brought our attention very firmly in a long letter on individual rights and freedoms, brought our attention to this idea that our tongue has many qualities and that it can contribute significantly to unity and harmony in the Baha'i community and the community at large, or it can create a lot of problems. This idea of the sin-covering eye seems to be so important. Seems to be something that's so critical right now for us in the Baha'i community to blossom, that we have to concentrate all our efforts. How do we learn to have the sin-covering eye? It seems that Abdu'l-Baha is our example once again. Abdu'l-Baha, in one of the tablets where he talks about this sin-covering eye, he even gave an example of Jesus Christ. You know that example where Abdu'l-Baha is saying that Jesus Christ was walking and, or according to Abdu'l-Baha, he said, it happened one day in the time of Christ, may the life of the world be a sacrifice unto him, that he passed by the dead body of a dog, a carcass reeking, hideous, the limbs rotting away. One of those present said, How foul it stench. And another said, how sickening, how loathsome. To be brief, each one of them had something to add to the list. But then Christ himself spoke. And he told them, look at that dog's teeth. How gleaming white. The Messiah's sin-covering gaze did not for a moment dwell upon the repulsiveness of that carrion. The one element of that dead dog's carcass, which was not an abomination, was the teeth. And Jesus looked upon their brightness. This is incumbent upon us, Abdu'l-Baha said, when we direct our gaze towards other people, to see where they excel, not where they fail. Well, there's another story of Abdu'l-Baha that I'm very fond of, because it was so powerful to me when I read this. One day, there was, ever since the beginning of this Baha'i faith, there's been this, what the Guardian and the Universal House of Justice describe as this dialectic of crisis and victory. You know what a dialectic is. It goes like this. There's this thesis, according in scientific terms, and it's met by an antithesis. And there's this conflict, and out of it, there's this synthesis. All right? Crisis, victory. All right? All the time, we're going along in this faith, and we're met by opposition, and we grow. It's true collectively, and it's true individually. We grow through tests. The more tests, the greater the growth. It's the same thing with the Baha'i community. In fact, there's going to be quite an increase in the opposition to the faith here in the West. The Universal House of Justice and the Guardian and Abdu'l-Baha remind us. And the Universal House of Justice said that we have to study this idea of the dialectic of crisis and victory in the cause and become very aware of this. This is a concept of growth in the Baha'i faith. This is how we see growth, human growth, both in terms of individually and collectively, and the fact that when this happens, and as it happens individually, as it's happening now, both attacks from outside the faith and from within, the Universal House of Justice said we have to be so confident that we're not perturbed for even one moment. But we won't be perturbed for even a moment. But all through the history of the faith, as we read about it, there have been attacks. And one of the attacks that was very foul was by a believer in Iran who turned against Abdu'l-Baha. See if I can remember his name. I think his name was Jamal Burujirdi. Burujirdi, I think. They called him the Kirkeftar. It's a really awful name. Something like, it's really, I don't know who gave him that name, but it's an awful name. He was a covenant breaker, and he was attacking Abdu'l-Baha. And the believers would come to Abdu'l-Baha and say, look what this guy is doing. And Abdu'l-Baha would say, he had the sin-covering eye. He said, no, don't talk. And they would come and say, look he's saying this, he's saying that, he's doing all these nasty things and so on. And Abdu'l-Baha was like this. And one day one of the believers came to Abdu'l-Baha and said, look he wrote he's not only saying this, he wrote it. He's distributing this literature against you. And Abdu'l-Baha said, he didn't sign it. Since he didn't sign it, Abdu'l-Baha didn't take it. Can you imagine the extent of his sin-covering eye? But of course, Abdu'l-Baha in his wisdom, even though he covered these things and concealed them so that giving the chance to the believers to come back, in his wisdom as the center of the covenant and the protector of the cause, when he died, he left in his will and testament a description of some of these nasty things so that the Baha'is would be aware and be protected. But while he was living, he always had the sin-covering eye. Friends, I want to conclude with one more story that moves me so much. And this is a story that moves me because it seems that we mustn't concern ourselves with our own weaknesses either. I've been talking about overlooking the weaknesses of our fellow believers and friends in the community and so on, but especially not our own. In fact, the Guardian said perhaps the reason that the teaching work hasn't progressed so much is the extent to which the believers look at their own weaknesses. We have to have complete trust in Baha'u'llah, complete confidence, such firm convictions. There was a believer from Hamadan in Iran. His name was Abdul Wahab. Abdul Wahab. He was a Babi, a follower of the Bab. Now, this was a time that was a real crisis in the faith of the Bab. All of the great heroes and heroines of the faith had been killed except for one, Baha'u'llah. Hujjat, Wahid, Qudus, Mullah Hussain, Tahirih, all of them had been killed. And Abdul Wahab was feeling moved to get closer to Baha'u'llah. And he traveled from Hamadan to Tehran to meet Baha'u'llah, to be with Baha'u'llah, this pillar of strength in the Babi community. And when he arrived in Tehran, he found out that Baha'u'llah had been arrested and was in prison, in this underground prison. And he went, he was feeling really alone in the faith. And he said, what can I do now? And then to make matters worse, he thought, he got arrested. Somebody recognized him as a Babi and he was arrested. And he said, now I'll never see him. And they threw him into prison and they chained him to the floor of the cell. And when his eyes focused in the darkness, he realized he was chained to Baha'u'llah. And he was so happy. He was so happy. Even though he was in prison, he had his heart's desire. He was with Baha'u'llah. He didn't doubt for a minute, really. He prayed, what can I do? It happened. Not the way he wanted. But it happened. You know, we plan and God plans. As Mr. Khadim used to say to us every year. We plan and God plans, and God is a better planner. He has a better plan. And Abdul Wahab, one night in that prison, he had a dream. And he dreamt that he met his beloved, and he was dancing. He was so happy. And he woke up and he told Baha'u'llah, he said, you know, I met my beloved, and I was dancing. It was such a lovely dream. Now remember, this is an awful place, and every day the executioners were asking the name, calling out the name of one of the Babis to come and to be executed. And Baha'u'llah turned to Abdul Wahab and said, this dream means that today is your day to meet your beloved. And the jail door opened and the gaoler, the executioner, called out the name Abdul Wahab. And he was so excited. He wasn't perturbed for a moment. He was so excited that he was going to meet his beloved that he wanted to dance. And then he realized, he said, I'm going to meet my beloved, I want to dance, and I don't have shoes on. I don't even own shoes. How can I meet my beloved? And Baha'u'llah himself took off his shoes and gave them to Abdul Wahab. And he danced to his death in the shoes of Baha'u'llah. We mustn't look at our weaknesses. We mustn't look at any of our deficits. Whatever we want, it might not happen the way we want it. But whatever we want, if our heart is pure, Baha'u'llah will give it. We don't have Baha'u'llah now to give us his shoes. But he left his words. And his words, according to the Universal House of Justice, are the medium and the wellspring for all growth and development, for transformation, for material, social, and individual growth. These words. Let me close by reading a prayer from Baha'u'llah. Thou seest, O my Lord, how thy servants are held captive by their own selves and desires. Redeem them from their bondage, O my God, by the power of thy sovereignty and might, that they may turn towards thee, when he who is the revealer of thy names and attributes is manifested unto men. Cast upon this poor and desolate creature, O my Lord, the glance of thy wealth, and flood his heart with the beams of thy knowledge, that he may apprehend the verities of the unseen world, and discover the mysteries of thy heavenly realm, and perceive the signs and tokens of thy kingdom, and behold the manifold revelations of this earthly life, all set forth before the face of him who is the revealer of thine own self. Direct then his eyes, O my God, towards the horizon of thy loving kindness, and make steadfast his heart in its attachment to thee, and unloose his tongue to praise thee, and make him able to hold fast the cord of thy love, and to cling to the hem of thy bounteousness, and to proclaim thy name amidst thy creatures, and to recount thy virtues throughout thy realm, in such wise that no obstacle will deter him from turning to thy name, the all-bountiful, and no veil shut him out from thee, in whose hand is the dominion of utterance and the kingdom of all names and attributes.